To understand why Concord failed, we need to know what Sony envisioned in the first place. In February 2022, Sony announced it was planning to release more than 10 live service games before March 2026, and Concord was supposed to be Sony's breakthrough into the hero shooter genre, a genre ruled by giants like Overwatch, Valorant, Apex Legends, and even Team Fortress 2. But this wasn't just another game for Sony, it was a major pivot from their usual strengths. Sony, a company known for their incredible single-player titles like The Last of Us and God of War, was suddenly diving headfirst into multiplayer live service games. And although they had a surprise hit with Helldivers 2, they clearly weren't paying attention when single-player focused BioWare epically failed with Anthem. In a big move, Sony acquired Firewalk Studios, the team behind Concord, from its parent company Probably Monsters. They were so committed to this idea that they made the acquisition a few years into the game's development. The exact price of the acquisition wasn't publicly disclosed, but the investment signaled Sony's determination to break into the live service model. Sony saw Firewalk as their ticket into the hero shooter space and hoped that Concord would become their next big multiplayer success. But despite Sony's vision and enormous financial commitment, Concord didn't even come close to meeting expectations. Instead of becoming Sony's breakthrough hero shooter, it stumbled right out of the gate, shutting down just 2 weeks after release. So what happened? Was it the woke content that some players criticised? Or were there deeper issues lurking underneath the surface? To understand Concord's failure, we need to look beyond the headlines and into the actual gameplay, character design, and the broader market it was trying to compete in. But first, let's address the elephant in the room. Concord faced immediate backlash from many players for what they perceived as woke content. The game was designed around characters with pronouns, transgender, and progressive themes. These elements, for some, were very off-putting and sparked a massive furor all across social media. Now, is this enough to actually kill the game? Not quite. While it's true that woke content can be polarizing, it's also true that players are ultimately driven by gameplay quality. Games like Overwatch and Valorant also feature diverse characters and social themes, but they thrive because of their core gameplay, engaging character designs, and regular content updates. Even outside of the hero shooter genre, games with perceived woke content have had mixed results. Some have absolutely flourished, while others have completely cratered. Dragon Age: The Veilguard is, of course, the most recent example of a commercial failure, largely due to backlash over identity politics that turned players away before they even engaged with the game to begin with. In complete contrast, Baldur's Gate 3 is an acclaimed success, quite arguably featuring just as many LGBTQ+ themes as The Veilguard. The reasons behind this disparity are complex, but those familiar with both titles will absolutely understand what I mean. Then there's Hogwarts Legacy. The game, released in 2023, was seen as a battleground between the identity politics brigade and the anti-woke campaigners. So much so that a boycott was called against the game due to Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling's comments around transgenderism and public thoughts on what constitutes a real woman. Interestingly though, despite the negative discourse around Rowling's comments, as well as the calls from transgender activists to boycott the game, Hogwarts Legacy, which was set in the 1890s, actually featured a transgender character going by the name of Serona Ryan. While Ryan doesn't explicitly come out and say that she's a trans character, she infers it through a particular dialogue piece where she says some classmates couldn't recognize her initially, and it took them a second to realize she was actually a witch and not a wizard. Then of course there was the diverse range of professors as well, which absolutely wouldn't have happened during that time in a normal educational institution in England. Clearly adding these pieces of woke content didn't deter gamers from buying the game, probably because it was such a small piece of the overall experience and not the main centerpiece of the game. As such, the game went on to sell 30 million copies, reportedly raking over $1 billion, and was the biggest commercial success of 2023. So while identity politics may have fueled some initial negative reactions to Concord, it didn't cause the game's complete downfall. If Concord had delivered quality gameplay and an engaging experience, players would have stayed, but that isn't what they got. To see the real reasons behind Concord's failure, let's start with the market it launched into. The hero shooter genre. In this genre, games are either free to play or they're so compelling that players will willingly pay up front. Concord launched with a $40 price tag, a tough sell when players can dive into Overwatch 2, Valorant, or even the older yet beloved Team Fortress 2 completely for free. In a crowded genre like this, where top competitors are accessible without cost, Concord's pricing created an unnecessary barrier. It would have needed something truly unique to justify that price, but clearly it couldn't deliver that. Another major issue was its character and art design. In a successful hero shooter, characters are memorable and iconic. Think of Overwatch's DVA and Mercy, or Valorant's Jet. Each character is visually striking and players can form connections with them. In contrast, Concord's character designs were widely criticized as bland and even unattractive. They were forgettable, lacking the distinct styles and colors that make a character stand out. In the world of hero shooters, your characters are your brand. They are what players connect with and what draw them back in. Without compelling character designs, Concord completely lacked that hook to keep players engaged. And character designs weren't the only uninspired aspects. Concord's gameplay itself was described as bland and repetitive. A hero shooter needs variety and depth in its gameplay mechanics to keep players coming back for more. Each match should feel fresh, with characters that bring unique playstyles and abilities to the table. But from what players experienced, Concord fell well short. The game didn't offer any groundbreaking mechanics or new ways to play, so players felt that they were just playing another generic shooter. And in an oversaturated genre, innovation is absolutely everything. Concord failed to give players a reason to choose it over the heavyweights like Overwatch, Valorant, Apex Legends, or many more, and with a $40 price tag, players were understandably not interested. So how did Sony miss such obvious signs that Concord was headed for the scrap heap? With the time and money Sony invested into Concord, they should have been vigilant in testing to ensure the game met their high expectations. By the first quarter of 2023, Concord had reached its alpha stage, but according to insiders, this early version was described as laughable, with core features such as monetization barely touched or non-existent at all. Even though Sony hadn't yet purchased Firewalk Studios at that point, they had been working closely with Probably Monsters, who was Firewalk's original parent company, since late 2020. This long-standing relationship meant Sony couldn't use the acquisition timing as an excuse for being unaware of Concord's development state. In July 2024, Concord entered its closed beta, failing to capture players' interest. When the open beta followed just a couple of weeks later, Concord peaked at just 2,388 concurrent players on Steam, a startlingly low number that signaled very weak interest. These early signals should have raised serious alarms, but Sony and Firewalk for some reason pushed forward with the launch regardless of these results. During a recent Q2 earnings call, Sony's president Hiroki Totoki acknowledged these testing missteps, admitting that internal testing and player feedback, what he called gates, should have been implemented much earlier. Totoki openly admitted that Sony is still in the process of learning how to handle live service games, especially when working with new IP. He stated, "Currently we are still in the process of learning. We probably need to have a lot of gates, including user testing or internal evaluation, and the timing of such gates. We should have done those gates much earlier than we did." Totoki's comments reveal more than just a few missed checkpoints. They hinted at a deeper cultural issue within Sony itself. He described Sony's organizational structure as siloed, noting that departments operate largely in isolation, with minimal collaboration across teams. This lack of cross-departmental communication likely played a part in why Concord missed vital feedback loops. Without open lines of communication and a flow of honest feedback, issues that should have been resolved early in development slipped completely through the cracks. But the issues run deeper than structural isolation. Insiders describe Concord's development as mired in toxic positivity, where constructive criticism was discouraged and team members were expected to maintain a positive outlook, even if it meant ignoring the glaring problems the game had in development. And in practice, this culture meant that feedback was filtered, with only positive comments reaching the higher-ups. Consequently, the development team felt pressured to offer only encouraging feedback, sidelining any meaningful critique that would have improved the game. This lack of open critique set Concord on a collision course with failure, as fundamental issues went completely unaddressed. Further complicating the matters was the involvement of Sony Interactive's head, Herman Holst, who reportedly saw Concord as a personal project and his baby. Holst's close attachment to Concord made it even harder for team members to voice concerns. When leaders at this level are deeply invested in a project's success, it can create an environment where dissent feels unwelcome, adding to the toxic positivity and stifling valuable feedback. This closed culture of unchecked optimism made it nearly impossible for Concord to evolve or address its fundamental flaws based on constructive criticism. This lack of critique and meaningful discussion is not unique to Concord. We've seen similar issues at other studios such as Ubisoft, where resistance to feedback has led to high-profile failures. Sony's insistence on pushing forward without adequately addressing internal critiques ultimately led Concord to its downfall. The systemic flaws that Totoki and others now recognise were in play long before Concord ever reached the hands of the public. Of course, Sony's leaders say that they've learned from Concord's failure and plan to apply these lessons to future live service games. But this costly mistake highlights the challenges of adapting to a new development model without the foundational processes in place. With Concord, Sony was so invested in creating their next big multiplayer hit that they completely missed the warning signs that should have halted its launch. This disconnect between expectations and reality reveals a company struggling to balance ambition with actionable insight, a very dangerous gap when venturing into live service gaming. Why then did Sony push forward with Concord despite all the warning signs? It seems that Sony was blinded by their own expectations. They saw Concord as their big multiplayer breakthrough and were determined to make it a success, despite the clear evidence that it was not ready whatsoever. Sony was shifting from single-player dominance to live service games, but they failed to recognise that they needed to adapt their development and management approach to meet the different demands of live service titles. In a way, Sony was more focused on the dream of what Concord could be than the reality of what it actually was. They wanted a competitor to Overwatch and Valorant, but they couldn't face the hard truth that Concord just did not live up to that standard at all. So what actually killed Concord? Was it the woke content? No, not at all. While the game's progressive elements might have initially put off many players, the core reasons for its failure run much deeper. Concord launched in an oversaturated market with a restrictive price tag, suffered from uninspired character design and gameplay, and was developed in a culture that refused to accept critical feedback. Ultimately, Sony's unrealistic expectations and their reluctance to adapt to the live service model played a massive role in Concord's failure. In the rush to create a multiplayer hit, they overlooked the fundamentals. So no, the woke didn't kill Concord, Sony did that on their own.